All right, it is time to get started. I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be exploring a recent book by Kai Bird entitled The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, published in May by Penguin Random House. Joining us for the discussion today is Meg Jacobs of Princeton University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center, who will be introducing our author and commentator and moderating the discussion later. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, since pandemic restrictions here in the virtual realm. We have 2 more sessions ahead of us this season, including one this coming Monday, July 29th at 4 p.m., when we return to discuss a new book by Wendy Goldman and Donald Filzer, Fortress Dark and Stern, the Soviet Home Front During World War II. We hope that you join us for that session as well. Behind the scenes, there are 2 people who make these seminars possible: Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And we'd like to thank the financial supporters of the seminar, both anonymous and not anonymous. And as always, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is now posted in the chat function, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will be introducing today's speakers. Christian, the Zoom room is yours.
Thanks, Eric. Delighted to introduce this panel and introduce our 2 wonderful and distinguished scholars who will be engaging in a conversation for the first part of this session, and then we'll open it up to, we hope, as many as we can get to in the audience. Kai Bird is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian who has published biographies of John J. McCloy, McGeorge Bundy, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Robert Ames, and now The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. He has also authored a memoir about his childhood in the Middle East, and he's the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, but comes to us today from Washington, D.C. Meg Jacobs teaches history and public affairs at Princeton University. She'll be serving as our commentator today and will be starting off the conversation. She is the author of many books and articles about American political history, including her work on the 1970s, her 2017 book, Panic at the Pump, The Energy Crisis and the Transformation of American Politics in the 1970s, looks at why American politicians failed to devise a long-term energy policy. She's the author of Pocketbook Politics, Economic Citizenship in 20th Century America, which was published by Princeton University Press and won the 2006 Organization of American Historians Prize for Best Book on Modern Politics. She has taught at MIT and been a fellow at the Harvard Business School, the Charles Warren Center, and the Radcliffe Institute. She's currently writing a book about the Great Depression and World War II. Welcome to both of you to the Washington History Seminar. So great to have you with us. And I guess I'll turn it over to Meg. Meg, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to discuss Kai Bird's phenomenal book. I don't think anybody held it up yet, so I will hold it up. Has a fantastic cover. You can also see its heft, and it's quite an accomplishment. So first, let me just begin by saying congratulations, Kai, on a great read of Jimmy Carter. So
thank you, Meg.
Let's just start at the beginning. Jimmy Carter, born to a peanut farmer in 1924, grew up in a home that had no electricity, I think, until 1935. Significant moment came with him. You have this very vivid description of him listening to the start of World War II, hearing about Pearl Harbor over the radio, made him want to serve. He goes off to Annapolis. He marries his neighbor and sweetheart, graduates from the Naval Academy in 1946, served on nuclear submarines before his father died in 1953, and he returns to Plains, Georgia, to lead the family business. So that's a very quick summation.
Excellently done. Very, very quick summary.
So, in all of that, this might be a bit of a corny question to start off with. Was there anything that made him sort of destined to become president?
His mother. I think if there's an answer to such an existential question, it's his mom, Miss Lillian, the famous Miss Lillian, who entertained us, on talk shows, TV talk shows in the 1970s, Johnny Carson and others, because she was so funny and so outspoken and such an eccentric Southern gentlewoman who was very outspoken and raised Jimmy to read at the dinner table all the time and to think that he was the smartest guy in the room, which he often was. And to understand that though she was raising her sons and daughters in the midst of a firmly segregationist society where her own husband was a confirmed white supremacist, nevertheless, she raised Jimmy to understand that Blacks were equals. And indeed, his playmates were all Blacks initially in the little hamlet in Archery, where he grew up 2 miles down the road from Plains. And she just was, she went around South Georgia talking about what a great man Abraham Lincoln was. She was a character. And I think she, if anything, explains his intellect, his liberal intellectual outlook on life, and why he's an outlier in South Georgia.
You discuss how he is an outlier in both national politics, which we'll get to in a bit, and also, as you just said, in Georgia. And you discuss his socially progressive views, certainly compared to his father and other Georgians. Do you see that as a driving force to getting him into politics first as a state senator, I think, in 1962?
You mean his sort of liberal attitudes on race?
Yeah.
Well, he certainly was a liberal on race, but no, I think what drove him in 1962 was just blind personal ambition. People think of Jimmy Carter as this very fine ex-president and humanitarian, a liberal, habitat for humanity. But actually, he's a very driven personality. And I think when he, after almost 8 years in the Navy, where he had a great Navy career, he quit in 1953 when his father suddenly died at a relatively young age of pancreatic cancer. And he went back to the family farm to save it, essentially. And he did so over the objections of his wife, Rosalind Carter, who liked the Navy life. But he came back and had, he loved planes, and he wanted to save the family farm. And I think he had realized that the Navy career dedicated to preparing weapons of mass destruction for use was not really his life goal. And so he came back to South Georgia, and then he quickly over the years got bored. And in 1962, he saw an opening for a a state senator position and an opening for someone who was an outlier politically like himself, because they had instituted some political reforms that broke apart the county system of voting, which was very heavily weighted to rural voters. And he didn't even tell his wife, Rosie. He put on his Sunday best and went down to the courthouse to register for this race, and improbably sort of won it very narrowly. But it was ambition. It was pure political ambition.
And do you think, and then he decides to run for governor. He then becomes governor. And he decides, in your telling, to run for president, or at least he makes his views known as early as 1974. So where does this sort of political drive come from? I mean, not everyone just says, I want to be president. So yes, ambitious. Can you sort of speculate more on sort of how he sort of saw his political path ahead of him?
Well, I think he didn't tell a lot of people, but I think he began running for the presidency in January of 1971, right after he was inaugurated as governor. Mm-hmm. He knew it was a one-term position as governor. It was term limited. He knew that he couldn't really, even if he wanted to run again, he probably would have had a tough time being a liberal in Georgia. So he immediately pivoted to running as a liberal Southerner, which was sort of a singular thing. It didn't exist. And that was his path to the presidency. Now, he by this time he had surrounded himself with what we know as the Georgia boys, Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell. And Hamilton Jordan was a really smart political operative who wrote him a memo in 1973 outlining how he could win the nomination. And it was, a brilliant analysis. Run in all the primaries, go to Iowa, win that caucus, try to win New Hampshire, and specifically try to defeat George Wallace. Mm-hmm. And that would make him emerge as the sort of the Southern hope.
You tell a great story talking about that sort of instant pivot when he gets into office to, I think you described sort of protests outside. He hangs a portrait of Martin Luther King Jr.
Right. No, that's 1970 gubernatorial race was very crafty. He was almost Machiavellian in his approach to the race. He had been defeated in 1966 when he first ran for governor. And this plunged him into a deep depression. And, he'd lost against an outright racist, and that was depressing. But he was determined. He began running again. And in 1970, he was determined to not get pigeonholed as too liberal on race. He was determined to win the white, rural, working class vote. And he, was very crafty and sort of walking right up to the red line and giving dog whistles, talking about how he understood rural whites who wanted to send their kids to private academies. And at the same time, he was the only first Georgia politician to sort of openly campaign in Black churches. And he felt very comfortable doing that. He'd always been comfortable in African-American culture. He could get up and sing their hymns. And so it was an astute campaign, really cool. And then on the day he was inaugurated, he pivoted right away and announced in his inaugural speech that the time for segregation in the South was over, shocking the audience in front of him. So this is a man who's really quite determined to achieve power.
So let's talk about his presidential race, how he actually succeeds, goes from Jimmy Who, which is sort of, this famous joke, no one knows who Jimmy Carter is, to actually winning the presidency in 1976. And one of the ways that he does it is by positioning himself as an outsider in that moment of 1976, when people are fed up with Washington insiders from Vietnam and Watergate. You have this great quote from Averell Harriman, one of the sort of foremost foreign policy establishment figures, who says, "He can't be president. I don't even know him."
Right.
Do you want to elaborate on why being an outsider made him a good candidate at this moment?
Well, it was his moment. It was the only moment, 1976, looking back, where he could, someone like Jimmy Carter could possibly have gotten elected. It was, just 2 years after Watergate. It was a year after the end, finally, of that long, brutal war in Vietnam. It was a time when the American people were disillusioned with their politicians and with the two parties and with Richard Nixon and then Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon. Much of it all seemed unseemly. And here comes a guy who runs not on issues per se, although he had very specific policy points that he talked about, but he was really running on character, his integrity. And he kept talking about, how the country deserved a president as good and as decent as the American people. This is a very vague kind of campaign, but it appealed. It struck a chord with an electorate that was tired and wanted a fresh face. And of course, it was, in retrospect, a brilliant. He saw his moment because, this is, anyone who runs for president has got to have a big ego. Carter has an enormous ego and a wealth of an intelligence. And, he understood that if he could become the liberal populist candidate from the South, he really had a chance, even against Ted Kennedy. And in 1974, when he first met Ted Kennedy at a speech and an event in Georgia, he assumed that Ted Kennedy was going to be the man to beat in 76. Well, Kennedy decided not to run. But the interesting thing is that Carter thought, even in 74, that he could beat him. He had a certain political arrogance to him, let's say.
I've written about the 1970s and American politics in the 1970s, and there's still a lot of things that I don't understand, of course. And now that you've studied Carter so intensely, I'm wondering if you want to reflect a little bit more about the 76 race, because one of the things that puzzles me always is why the race was as close as it was. So we can sort of tell this story about Carter and the man for the moment and an outsider, and all of that is true. Feel free also to talk about rock and roll here. I watched that whole documentary about his friendship with Greg Allman, but the race was kind of close in spite of the pardon and all that. And I'm wondering, and I've always sort of wondered about that. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit more on why you think the race was so close.
Well, looking back on it 40, almost 50 years later, it's clear the country was moving in a conservative direction. And, we were about to see the Reagan Revolution unfold. So that's one explanation. The other is that, Carter was an outlier, was so improbable, ran on character and integrity. And then, in the summer of 76, he was way ahead in the polls. He had a 26-point margin at one point against Jerry Ford, the incumbent president, unelected president. But naturally, as the November general election approached, the polls narrowed. And then Carter made a number of missteps. Not unusual, but he famously talked about how he had lust in his heart. And people remember that quote, of course, and it came from a Playboy interview that he gave to Robert Scheer, great investigative journalist. And that quote sort of set back his whole image as a candidate running on integrity and character, and it alarmed his Southern Baptist religious base, and it gave pause. Is this guy a little too much of a unknown? So the race, you're quite right, narrowed considerably, and it was a squeaker. He won by the state of Mississippi at the very end at 3 a.m. So
yeah, I think we tend to forget that it was a very close race, and I think that you're right in some ways. To see Jimmy Carter and the narrowness of his victory in a sort of larger transitional moment when the direction of American politics was sort of unclear. But nevertheless, I think you're correct that his status as an outsider helped him to win. How did that outsider status hurt him when it came to governing?
Well, he had a existential problem in his own head. I'm talking about, in that he believed, he'd been raised to believe by Miss Lillian that he was the smartest guy in the room, and he was intelligent, but he was also a Southern Baptist who knew that the greatest sin was pride. And he knew he had an awful lot of pride and a large ego and these political ambitions. And so the way he resolved this internal psychological conflict, I argue, is quite straightforwardly. He read Reinhold Niebuhr's books about politics and religion, and loved the notion that Niebuhr advances that politics is a sinful business, but necessary, and that politicians who win power have a responsibility then to act morally upon their in office, and therefore, once you win power, like Jimmy Carter did with the White House, you have to use that power to simply do the right thing, and regardless of politics, regardless of the political costs. And so that's how he governed. And of course, it wasn't a recipe for getting himself reelected, but it was, in fact, a pretty good recipe for getting a lot of good things done. And that's, again, the sort of surprising thing about his presidency. He's regarded as a great ex-president, but a failed president. And that's not actually true. It's, he got a lot of legislation passed, both in domestic and foreign policy fields, and we can talk about that, but it came at real political costs. Yeah.
So he faced challenges governing, you just suggested, and I think accurately, because he sort of governed with this sort of moral compass, and believed that policy mattered more than politics in a certain way. Did the so-called peanut brigade, that is the sort of group of advisors, you referred to them earlier as the Georgia boys, all his advisors that he had with him in Georgia and then brought with him to the White House, how did they sort of navigate Washington, and to what extent do you see them as sort of magnifying this sort of governing challenge that Jimmy Carter had?
Well, it was a real shock to the Georgia set in Washington, D.C. when the Georgia boys arrived in town. You know, they talked differently, they dressed differently, they were much more casual. They were regarded as unsophisticated. And there was, you know, a real cultural disconnect between the Washington establishment and Carter and his people. But they were actually not, you know, they weren't stupid. They were quite crafty. They had seized power, and they were aware of the prejudice that Northerners had against Southern boys like themselves. But, well, I take, for instance, let's talk a moment about Charlie Curbo, who was Carter's longtime lawyer dating back to 1962 when he first ran for that Georgia state race. And Curbo was described to me as sort of a Atticus Finch of the Carter administration, the slow talking, you know, this South Georgia drawl, very quiet, soft spoken. He, on the face of it, he seemed to have no background or experience with national politics, but he was actually extremely astute. And one of the great contributions I have in this book is that I found his papers, or rather, I persuaded Jimmy Carter to find his lawyer's papers, which were in 5 cardboard boxes in the attic of Curbo's widow in Bainbridge, Georgia. And I'm the first historian to have gotten access to these papers, and they're fabulous. They are a window into Jimmy Carter's mind. And Curbo ends up advising him, and coming up to the White House every 2 or 3 weeks, but he refused to take a position in the White House. Carter wanted to offer him chief of staff. He offered the position to him. He was the only person who was offered that position. And Curbo turned him down, saying that he couldn't afford to move to Washington, D.C., which is kind of an exaggeration, but it was a reflection of Curbo and, you know, sort of Georgia boys' disconnect with Washington. They didn't understand the place, and the Washington establishment didn't understand them. So it was a disconnect, and this was particularly evident in the coverage of the Washington Post. And in the book, I give a great deal of space actually to the Post coverage of the Carter administration, and particularly Sally Quinn's barbs in the style section. But it was a unfortunate cultural disconnect. They spoke 2 different languages, and even though that politically, you know, they were on the same page often.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. You also spend a lot of time talking about how he and many in the Democratic Party, the sort of New Deal liberals, were not always on the same political page. And you refer, I think one of your chapter titles is called Trouble with Liberals. Right. And that really could be a theme extended throughout the book. And that's more than just a cultural clash.
True.
And, you have this great quote from a political operative who says that Carter will adopt any idea, no matter how radical, as long as it doesn't cost money.
Exactly.
And I don't know if you think that that's sort of fair. I wonder if you want to sort of reflect more about Carter's sort of fiscal conservatism, and more generally, maybe just reflect, is that the only thing or the main thing that you see sort of causing friction with liberals like Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill? He also reflects Carter in his diary. I think this was from 1978. So he's sort of aware of these tensions, that he feels more at home with conservative Democrats and Republicans than he does with others. So I wondered if you want to sort of reflect on sort of tension with liberals and sort of Jimmy Carter's conservatism.
Well, he was a social liberal, on most issues, but a small town fiscal conservative. He ran a peanut warehouse. He was an agribusinessman, not actually a peanut farmer, but an agribusinessman in South Georgia. And it was all about balancing the books. And he brought that sensibility to Washington. And he was horrified by the growing federal deficit, which was, ranging from $30 to $60 billion when he was president, which seems like nothing today. And he really, I criticize him in the book for not understanding Alfred Keynes and Keynesianism, and how, his whole approach to fighting inflation was sort of misplaced, and he didn't understand that asking McDonald's to keep their prices down was going to work, and that inflation was being driven by oil prices, as you write in your book, Panic at the Pump. And so his small town fiscal conservativeness sort of drove liberals like Ted Kennedy and Tip O'Neill crazy. They thought, here we have our chance, a Democratic president for the first time since Lyndon Johnson, and he doesn't want to spend money. But you're right, he was willing to spend money if it was proven to be for poor people. So, for instance, he was willing to open up the food stamp program to 3 million new recipients, largely Southern, poor, Black people in the South. But liberals found him very confusing. He appointed all these Ralph Naderites, acolytes of Nader, to prominent positions in the federal bureaucracy. And they were really tough liberal regulators. And they, under his term, we got seat belts and airbags and cleaner air and water. And, corporations were very unhappy with that liberal agenda. On the other hand, he didn't understand labor unions. There was, again, a cultural disconnect. And then it all came to a head, I believe. I argue in the book, when I talk about troubles with liberals, it's really Ted Kennedy. And the issue is healthcare. Now, both men had run on national health insurance. Both men favored essentially a single payer plan. But when Carter got into office, he looked at the budget, and Kennedy's bill seemed just outrageously expensive. So he approached Kennedy and said, let's have a foot in the door approach, and we'll have a bill for a national catastrophic health insurance, just catastrophic events. No family in America would pay more than $5,000 for a health crisis. And Kennedy said no. The labor union said no. UAW led the charge politically to have a single payer plan. And the result was Kennedy refused to compromise, Carter refused to compromise, and we got nothing. It was a major failure and a major tragedy that we're still living with 40 years later.
Yeah, it's not only that the liberals sort of thought, oh, we're getting the White House back, but they had the kind of numbers in Congress that Biden could only dream of.
Right.
They had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. So the idea that you couldn't get something done with those numbers, that sort of magnified, I think, the sense of failure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about policies, successes and failures, domestic and foreign policy. Let's talk first about foreign policy. You talk about his many accomplishments, from improving relations with China, pursuing détente with the Soviet Union, reduction in arms sales, of course, injecting human rights into policy discussions. And then you spend a lot of time on Camp David, on the Camp David Accords. And in this section, you give a very compelling you slow down the narrative. That must have been a specific author's choice. And yes. You sort of day by day, almost minute by minute account of this summit that Carter conducts with Sadat and Begin. I wonder, so it meant a lot to Carter. It clearly, as his biographer, meant a lot to you because you go through it very slowly. So I wonder if you can reflect on why this was so important to him. Hear a little bit about that. And then I'm also really curious about why you think this was important to the American public. This does seem to be a moment where sort of Carter's decision to do what he thinks is the right thing seems to match up with what the American public thinks. And I think you mentioned that he has something like a 13-point jump in his popularity in the polls, which I wonder if you can explain a bit. I'm just really struck that, so I want to know, why did Carter care so much, but also why did the American public care so much? And then maybe you can also reflect on why everyone always points to this as his greatest accomplishment, because one of the things that I also paid attention to in your account is how insightful he was about the actual limitations of what he had accomplished.
Right. Well, it is a fact that most presidents, regardless of their interests, they end up spending a lot of time on foreign policy. And part of this is because it's so much more sexy and easy to think that you're having an effect. And it's more fun as such. But for Carter, it was odd in that from day one, he made the Middle East a priority. And over the opposition of his national security advisors, Big Brzezinski, even Cyrus Vance, they all said, there's no political gain here. It's a hornet's nest. It's going to be very difficult, improbable that you'll achieve anything. Carter, though, he had no real background in the Middle East. He'd spent 1 week traveling around in a station wagon with Jody Powell and Rosalind back in 1970, 73, 74. But he did think of the Middle East in sort of moralistic religious terms, of course, because he read the Bible every day and he thought of it as the Holy Land. And as a smart guy, he'd read all the policy papers that he'd gotten from the Trilateral Commission, where he had first been exposed to foreign policy, tutored by one's Big Brzezinski. And he thought he saw the obvious solution, which was mutual recognition and withdrawal from the occupied territories, and essentially a two-state solution, although they didn't talk about it in those explicit terms at that point. Anyway, Camp David is an extraordinary achievement. It would never have happened except for Jimmy Carter. And his personal diplomacy, bringing these two contentious, difficult leaders, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, to Camp David for 13 days. And it's just an extraordinary story. And I also argue, I think somewhat controversially, that Carter thought he had achieved actually a comprehensive peace, not just a separate peace between Egypt and Israel. He thought that he had gotten Menachem Begin to agree to a 5-year freeze of the settlements. He really believed that. And I make, I think, a good case that Begin deceived the president. And this is an important point because it explains why Carter spent the next 40 years paying attention to this, trying to push the Israelis to stop building settlements, and why he controversially used the word apartheid in his 2007 book, got into more trouble about that. This is all very conscious on his part, and it dates back to what he thinks happened at Camp David in 1978. But yes, I did pay attention. I slowed down the narrative there because I have a personal interest in the Middle East. It still obsesses me and upsets me. I also think as a presidential historian of Carter. It's an important story to this day because we're still wrestling with this, the consequences of what happened in 1978.
And do you want to reflect on the other part of my question? Why, besides the obvious, it's a moment of peace rather than war, why do you think he gets such a jump in the polls?
Oh, that's right. Yeah. No, it is curious. I mean, in fact, the American people don't often care very much about foreign policy. And the Middle East is in the headlines almost every day, but most American voters sort of shy away from the subject and don't understand it and don't care about it. But, this was an extraordinary moment. It was very theatrical. The president disappears for 13 days with these two foreign leaders and suddenly appears on the White House lawn with a peace agreement. So I think it made sense that he would get a temporary bump in the polls significantly, like 13%. But, and then he had to, in the spring, the next spring, he had to go back to the Middle East and actually pin down the agreement all over again. It was, it was never done as such.
Let's talk about the other significant time that Carter spent at Camp David, which I've written a lot about and still surprises me to read accounts. The idea that in the summer of 1979, as there's gas lines 500 cars deep, across the country, Carter thinks the thing to do is to retreat to Camp David for 10 days for an intellectual summit where he assembles, sociologists and labor leaders and politicians and preachers and everyone. And most importantly, he brings Pat Cadell, a 29-year-old pollster who has been telling Carter, the problem with your governing isn't you, really. It's the American public, that they're experiencing some kind of existential crisis since the 1960s, which Cadell says is a crisis of confidence, the combination of assassinations and the loss in Vietnam and Watergate. And until you sort of address this on a sort of existential level, you won't actually be able to govern.
Right.
And Carter thinks, oh, that makes sense. I agree with that. And, and we can understand from everything you've said, why that might make sense to him, but it's still kind of shocking. And many of his policy advisors disagree that this is what he should be doing during this.
Walter Mondale almost resigned at this moment.
Yeah, and then you have a great quote where Mondale tells him, the country doesn't have a psychiatric problem, it has an economic one. But Carter didn't listen. And after these 10 days are over, he famously goes on television, gives this crisis of confidence speech, and he sort of pounds his fist on the desk and he says, the problem is that you Americans own too many things, that material goods can't fulfill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. So you studied him. Tell me, why did he do this? And in your opinion, was it a good idea?
Well, politically, it turns out to have been a terrible idea. But I just ran into Rick Hertzberg over the weekend in Plains, Georgia, where we were both celebrating Carter's 75th wedding anniversary. And Hertzberg had a great deal to do with writing that speech, and he's still very proud of it. It is a brilliant speech. It is a sermon to the American people. It is heartfelt from Carter. It is Carter. It's, this is the guy talking about limits and, to the American people, a very un-American idea. He's talking about you can't You can't seek happiness only in material benefits. This is the guy who, when he visits his Carter Center in Atlanta 1 week a month, he pulls down a Murphy bed in his studio apartment. He lives very simply even to this day. And so this resonated, this message. He was an intellectual in that way. He read, I think at the suggestion of Pat Cadell, he read Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism. And that message that America was too narcissistic, too focused on the material, not paying attention to the environment, not willing to sacrifice for the community, was too individualistic. This is, this resonates with his own radical Christian view of the world. And it's ultimately the reason for a moment, the American people were shocked when they listened to this speech. And I think it resonated as truthful to some. He got a bump in the polls, actually. But it's essentially a prophetic, a prophet's message that is not in the mainstream American culture. And so it was ultimately used against him by Ronald Reagan, who campaigned on just the opposite message. America is back, a sunny America. Let's believe in all our myths. Carter didn't believe in myths. And this is another essential argument I make in the book, particularly at the end, that he, as a Southern man, particularly as a Southern liberal, as a Southern intellectual, understood defeat. He understood limits. He understood, because he grew up in a culture that believed it had been occupied by the North. So not all life is about victories or sunny outcomes. So he was he was very receptive to the message that Cadell brought to him. And he was very tired of giving one energy speech after another. So this is why he did the Camp David Domestic Summit and the Malaise, so-called Malaise speech. It's an extraordinary moment.
I'll just wrap up with a couple of questions. Sunny optimism, of course, takes us to Ronald Reagan in 1980. We don't have a lot of time left, but let me just ask you about that election. Of course, everyone remembers that Ronald Reagan won, and many also probably remember that before he could face off against Reagan, Jimmy Carter had to beat Ted Kennedy in the primaries. So who posed a bigger threat to Carter? And why would you say that in the end he lost, and should he have maybe done anything differently?
Well, it's important to remember that though that race was a landslide in the end, up until 2 weeks before the election, the polls were actually pretty close. Carter at times was within 5 points, the margin of error. And he, as a sort of inveterate optimist and believer in himself, he actually thought he was going to win. But he had lost, in 1976, he had won the Southern vote, white Southern vote. He had won the Jewish American vote by 72%. He'd won the evangelical vote. He'd won labor union household voters. And he lost all of those votes by 1980. He had, despite Camp David and taking Egypt off the battlefield for Israel, Jewish American leaders were very suspicious of him. Ed Koch, openly thought he was, quote, anti-Israel, and said so. He lost. Some people told me in my interviews that Carter lost because of the 3 Ks, Ted Kennedy, Ayatollah Khomeini, and Ed Koch. But it was actually a fairly close election to the end. And I think in the end, you have to say that it was really the Iran hostage crisis that brought him down. It was a terribly debilitating crisis and 444 days. And Carter refused to use military force and thought that diplomacy would win the hostages' release without any loss of life, which eventually did happen. But again, it was at enormous political cost. And then, of course, we haven't talked about the October surprise, which I devote a small chapter to. But I think I make a good case that the evidence shows that William Casey did indeed go to Madrid, Spain in July of 1980 and sent a message to an Iranian envoy there that they could get a better deal from Reagan. And this is an outrageous interference in foreign policy and probably prolonged the hostage crisis. But
let me ask a final question and then we'll open it up. Just about your sort of overall assessment, in 1 minute or less. You quote Gore Vidal saying, Carter is a decent man, if an inept politician. And I think you disagree with that. I think you wouldn't characterize him as inept. I think you characterize him as someone who is more sort of oddly non-political, even though he runs for the highest political office in the land. And that, in a sense, is what made him an outlier, that he was sort of non-political in a political world. So is that what you sort of mean by outlier? And in the final assessment, do you think it was a good thing to be an outlier?
Well, I certainly disagree with Vidal. I quote Vidal there, but I certainly don't think that Carter was politically inept. He was actually quite astute at times, particularly in learning how to campaign, how to win power. And he was astute at governing in many ways. He actually accomplished quite a bit. And I think in retrospect, his reputation is going to inevitably rise. He was, I would argue, certainly the most intelligent president we've had in even the whole 20th century, including Kennedy and Roosevelt. I mean, Carter was very astute, very well-read, hardworking. He read and made marginal comments in 200 pages of memos every day in the White House. He got up at 5:30, was in the Oval Office by 6:37, and worked, until late into the night often. And of course, we all know he's probably the most decent man in our memory to have occupied the Oval Office. So I think he's going to be regarded better and better as time goes by.
Great. Thank you, Meg, for starting us off with a terrific set of questions that allowed Kai, I think, to really highlight some of the key contributions of his book. There are 3 ways you can participate. I'm talking to our audience now in this conversation. Our preference is for you to use the raise hand function so we can actually bring you directly into this conversation. You can also use the Q&A function at the top and post a question. We'll put it to Kai. Our preference, though, is to get you in live, so to speak. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to email Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. Before we go to audience questions, and as you get in line, I think Eric and I also have a million questions. We won't ask them, but let me start off with a 3-fold question. I'll turn it over to Eric, and then we'll go to the audience. Kai, why did you write this book, and why did you write this book now? Was this a decision based on an agent's recommendation, or why now? Connected with that, these questions sort of go to the writing piece of it. If you can talk for a moment about any new sources that you've uncovered. You already mentioned the Kerbal Papers. Are there any others, documents or oral histories or other sources that set your biography apart? And then third, what was your biographer? What was the particular challenge of writing a biography of Carter versus some of the other characters that you have written about?
Well, I chose Carter because I've had a longstanding interest in him, curiosity about him. I actually explored the notion of doing a biography of Carter just as I was finishing my first book about John McCloy in 1990. And I'd written about Carter in that McCloy biography because of the Iran hostage crisis that McCloy was involved in. And it made me curious about Carter. But when I went down to Georgia, I discovered that it seemed to me to be a foreign country. I didn't understand the South. I didn't understand Southern Baptists. I'm not sure I still understand the South. It's a very complicated culture and society. But I was curious about Carter, and after many other books, I came back to him in 2015, and I wanted to do a book about a president. And by that time, his papers had opened up. Whereas in 1990, they were still largely classified. So to answer your question about sources, yes, in the Carter Library, I found a wealth of new information, documents that have been declassified, really important stuff about the Iran hostage crisis in the last 10 years and even more recently. Carter's own diary is extremely valuable. He's published about 20% of it. 80% is still closed. Even I haven't seen it. Though I asked for it. He said no on privacy-ish grounds. But the diary is very useful, gossipy, substantive, critical. I also benefited from getting the diary of one of his White House aides, Landon Butler. And that proved to be sort of a fly on the wall source because Landon was there in the White House, the number one aide to Hamilton Jordan. I also found, I was having an interview with one of Carter's speechwriters, Jerry Doolittle, who'd been there for 2 years in the first 2 years of the administration. And it wasn't a very good interview over the phone. And at the end of it, I said, well, Jerry, if you have any other documents you find in your closet or photographs, please remember me. And he says, well, I do have a diary. It turned out to be 150 pages, neatly typed, really astute and colorful observations about people. So it allowed me to really describe characters, Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, who are really, smart, intelligent, colorful personalities. So that's why I wrote the book, and that's some of the sort of new sources that were found.
Great. How about the biggest challenge as a biographical subject?
Oh, yes. Well, I've written 4 other biographies, and this is the first, quote, presidential biography. And it was a real challenge in that, to create a narrative that is readable and, doesn't get too bogged down in detail about a man who's across whose desk every day there's not 1 or 2 issues, but dozens of issues. It was a real challenge to be able, and particularly for me, to cover all these domestic issues. My background is sort of more in foreign policy, so I had to get up to speed on deregulation of natural gas and the trucking industry and the federal budget and congressional politics. It was a challenge.
Thank you. Eric.
Thanks, Christian. Absolutely fascinating book. I'm wondering if you could stick to the issue of the turn to the right and perhaps Carter's role in facilitating this. In hindsight, it's very clear the new right is building its infrastructure. You have a wonderful passage about the moral majority and a group of ministers meeting with Carter. But on the other side is the New Deal coalition, which seems to unravel by 1980, or at least there are significant enough defections to doom Carter's reelection. And it strikes me that in playing the role, maintaining the role of outsider, in not cultivating relations on Capitol Hill and with other Democrats, with not truly grasping the economic issues that are impacting at least many of those in the New Deal coalition. Carter, with his stinginess or his fiscal conservative sensibilities, helps to bring about that very disintegration. And so he contributes to this somewhat shift to the right at this point. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it certainly wasn't his intention. But he did decide to deregulate much of the American economy. Now, Ronald Reagan gets the credit for that in retrospect. But it was Jimmy Carter who deregulated the airline industry, for instance, which he did at the encouragement of people like Ralph Nader, who were coming at this issue from the point of view of consumers. And so, indeed, it did allow middle-class Americans to fly in large numbers for the first time because prices fell down with more competition in the airline industry. But it also put pressure that was already growing on the labor union. So it hurt the labor unions representing workers in the airline industry. And that was true of the trucking industry when he deregulated trucking and railroads. And yet he did all these things with the fervent support of liberals. But you're right, this does sort of accelerate the fact that where we have today a very small percentage of the working force is represented by trade unions. But coming back to what Meg said, I agree, the country was, in fact, as we realize now, moving in a conservative trajectory. Carter himself believes that if he had had a second term, that he would have killed inflation as Volcker, with the appointment of Volcker, and that the economy would have roared back in a big way in 82, 83, and that by the time he left the presidency in 84, he would have patched together a sort of new version of the New Deal coalition. But in retrospect, we see that this was a tipping point. And this is one of why I was interested in the Carter presidency, because it became a tipping point between this old New Deal liberalism and the Reagan conservative revolution. But that certainly wasn't Carter's intention. And in the end, I think partly he was defeated by the central issue of race. He was the Southern candidate who won the South in 1976, and he loses it in 1980. And it was all about race. He had disaffected that constituency, white rural voters, male voters, by his perceived favoritism to African Americans, by appointing more African American judges to the federal bench, for instance, than all his predecessors before, to appointing high-ranking Blacks to his administration, to being willing to spend money on poor people. And all of this, it came down to race. And again, this is the tragedy of American history. And this is the tragedy, I think, of Carter's presidency, that it was he won as a white liberal Southerner, and he lost as a white liberal Southerner. He was rejected by not only the country, but specifically his own part of the country.
One very quick foreign policy question. If I discern a villain in your story, It's Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, who you don't have much nice to say about. How poorly served was Carter by his national security advisor? And you make reference in the acknowledgments to the Brzezinski diaries that you were not given permission to see. Any thought on what might be in there?
Oh, I think a lot of embarrassing things. No, Brzezinski kept a very detailed diary. He told me it was as long or longer than Carter's own diary. And he does quote from it selectively in his Power and Principle memoir, but that's all that we've ever seen of it. And yes, Brzezinski comes off as, he comes off as someone who argued constantly with Carter. They disagreed on most issues. Carter had a foreign policy worldview that was much closer to Cy Vance's than to Brzezinski. Brzezinski came to the Oval Office every day with the views of a Polish-American aristocrat who hated the Russians. I mean, that's putting it bluntly, but he was always telling Carter to stand up to the Russians, to be tougher with the Russians. And this is very clear in the archives. At one point early in the spring of 77, Brzezinski writes a memo, saying we have to find a way to send a message to the Russians, to the Soviets. And we should do this by doing something confrontational. And Carter writes in the margins, like Mayaguez, like the Mayaguez ship that was a disaster rescue attempt off the coast of Cambodia, organized, authorized by Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford, that led to great loss of life. And it was all over nothing and was unnecessary. And that was Carter's view of military power. He wanted to use it only when absolutely necessary. Brzezinski and he disagreed all the time about the Middle East, about the Soviet Union, about the famous Soviet brigades in Cuba, where Brzezinski almost resigned. He was so frustrated that Carter couldn't take advantage of this little crisis to escalate it and to turn it into a major confrontation with the Soviets. And Carter realized it was all ado about nothing. And the mystery in my narrative is that I can't understand, given their relationship, why Carter tolerated him so long, except when I asked him, he would say, Zbig was entertaining. He would come to me with 100 ideas every day, and I'd have to reject all but one or two of them. But he was the kind of guy you'd want to sit next to on a long plane ride. And yet, on the other hand, I tell this story that I got from Brzezinski. When I interviewed him, he very proudly told me a story about how he'd had a fierce argument with Carter in the White House, in the Oval Office. They disagreed, and Brzezinski stomped out, went back to his West Wing office. And a few minutes later, Susan Clow, the president's personal secretary, walks in and ostentatiously presents Brzezinski with a green envelope, green stationery, which signifies that this is a message, a handwritten message from the president. And Zbig says he opened up the note, and there said, "Dear Zbig, do you ever know when to stop?" And Zbig was proud of this. He thought this reflected well on his relationship, that the president and he could argue so openly. But it was actually, I think, a debilitating relationship, and one that came at serious cost to Carter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's bring in our audience. We'll first go to Nancy Lynn, and then Thomas Schwartz. Nancy, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself, otherwise we won't be able to hear you. All right, if I might try back later. Let's go to Tom Schwartz.
Hello, can you
Hi,
hear
Tom.
me?
Yep.
Hi, Kai.
Yes, good to hear from you, Tom.
I agree with you completely that the achievement with Egypt, the Camp David agreements, one of the greatest achievements of the Carter administration. However, in terms of the Middle East and in general, in terms of the long-term legacy, to what extent do you think the Carter administration failed rather badly in handling the Shah and then Iran in general? There's been a fair amount of information about the missteps during the Iranian, even before the Shah was overthrown. And what judgment would you make in the end on his approach to Iran?
Okay, good question. Well, I argue in the book that the Iranian Revolution was not something that was going to be stopped, whoever was in the White House. It was an organic revolution that came from the streets of Tehran and elsewhere in the country. The Shah was becoming more and more unpopular. And I spend a lot of pages on sort of month by month, day by day, how they tried to figure out what was happening. They had very poor intelligence. And Brzezinski, coming back to his big Brzezinski, was constantly pushing Carter to try to do something in a military fashion to rescue the Shah's regime. But the military advisors were telling him, well, what short of a major invasion are you talking about? I mean, there were massive demonstrations in the street, escalating in Tehran, and the Shah himself was clearly didn't have the gumption to the wherewithal to think that he could crack down and without enormous loss of life. They did consider a coup attempt, and Brzezinski kept pushing for this. And Carter was resistant, but he was willing to consider it if it seemed to have a realistic chance. But there was no realistic option for stopping the revolution. And then on the post-revolution period and leading up to the hostage crisis, I don't blame Carter. I blame Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and John McCloy, who formed a private lobbying operation that they codenamed Project Alpha. They gave it a budget. They assigned Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy lawyers to work on this. Rockefeller hired a publicist, and they set out a calendar where every week some high official in the Carter administration was lobbied to admit the Shah for political asylum, which Carter knew and feared would would inflame the passions in the street in Iran even more, and might in fact lead to a seizure of the embassy. So he was right, and the Kissinger and McCloy crowd were wrong, and they were wrong to push him on this. And finally, Carter only acceded when told by Cy Vance that the Shah he thought should be admitted for humanitarian reasons because he was suffering from cancer. And of course, as we all know, that did precipitate the hostage crisis. And there was really, Carter became a victim of circumstances, both from the Iranian Revolution and from the hostage crisis, which he solved in the end, but and he brought out all the hostages without harm, but it was again an enormous political cost.
Thank you. Let's go next to Stephen Schwartz. Stephen Schwartz. Please unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, thank you. Kai, you had mentioned at the beginning of the talk something that I wasn't aware of, that one of the reasons Carter left the Navy was his disinterest in preparing nuclear weapons for use in a nuclear war. So I wanted to ask you, Carter probably spent, in fact, definitely spent more time thinking and learning about and improving U.S. nuclear weapons and warfighting plans, especially the controversial PD-59 and command and control systems, than any president since Dwight Eisenhower. The massive and expensive across-the-board overhaul and expansion of our nuclear arsenal, particularly our strategic delivery systems, commenced on Carter's watch, but was typically referred to as the Reagan buildup throughout the 1980s, and is still largely credited to Reagan even today, much like the deregulation that you talked about a few minutes ago. I'm curious what your book says about this aspect of his presidency and Carter's evolving views about nuclear weapons and nuclear war.
Yeah, well, I think he was very skeptical of them, of the weapons. And, when he left the Navy, he apparently commented many years later to his good friend, Dr. Peter Bourne, that he just didn't think that he was made out to spend the rest of his life associated with weapons of mass destruction. But becoming president, he thinks of himself as a nuclear engineer, and he is a man who pays attention to detail. And so I think he looked at the war plans, the PSYOP plans, and decided that they were crazy. And this began the jump-started the process of sort of trying to come up with, quote, a saner war plan and modernization of these weapons. And he was in favor of SALT II, and he wanted as few of these weapons as possible. But he's a president who inherits this war-making machine that's all based on the atomic bomb, and it's a contradiction.
Thank you. Let me ask you a question posted by Elizabeth Cohen. The 1970s is often considered the crucial time when American deindustrialization began, a transformative moment for U.S. industry and labor. How did Carter, rural-based and yet an engineer and businessman himself, view this challenge? What actions did he take to address it?
Well, I don't think at the time he saw it as deindustrialization. It was something that was just beginning to take place. We still had a steel industry. We still had a vibrant auto industry. He saved, the Chrysler Auto Company when it was on the brink of bankruptcy. He normalized relations with China, and he was very proud of that. But of course, human actions all have unintended consequences, and one of the consequences of normalizing relations with China is that this accelerated the deindustrialization of America with opening up of trade to a much cheaper labor market in China. And this, again, I think was probably inevitable. It was going to happen. And normalization was probably a good thing. We don't live in isolation from the rest of the world. And so Carter gets credit for normalizing relations, but many decades later, I think we can all sort of look back rightly and say, well, there was the American working class paid a heavy consequence for this. So it's, again, another contradiction in history.
Thank you. James Mettray writes, you both described the 1976 presidential election as very close, yet Carter won the Electoral College by 57 votes, which I think is a sizable margin, though perhaps not a landslide. He also won the popular vote by just less than 2%, which is a solid majority. I would not call it very close. Could you explain why you think that your characterization is correct.
Oh, Meg, do you want to handle that one?
Sure. I think, I think the close in the sense that we recall Carter as having this sort of great victory, and we sort of tell the narrative, whether it's correct or incorrect, that once Ford pardoned Nixon, that he was in real political trouble. But I think, as you have correctly discussed, and as some of the questions have indicated, really the 1970s is this transitional moment when it's not clear what direction politically the country is going in. Even if it's going to the right, it's not clear who exactly is going to be the beneficiary of that impulse and how. And certainly compared to 1964, which was a liberal landslide, and 1980 and 84, which was a conservative landslide, and even compared to 72, 76 does not stand out as a sort of obvious victory one way or the other for a certain set of politics. That's what I had in mind.
Yeah, I think, Carter, the pundits thought that Carter should have won by a larger margin, given his campaign, given his opponent being an unelected president, given Watergate and the aftermaths of the Vietnam War. He had done so well coming from behind, and then it looked like at the very end he might have lost it.
Yeah. Let me call on John Martin next. John Martin, and then Barbara Couple. John.
Thank you, Christian. Kai, I'm a retired network television correspondent, and I'm a research fellow at the Wilson Center. This sounds like a terrific book. And I'm wondering, I covered Jerry Brown in the 76 primaries. And as we remember, Carter won a lot of early primaries, and then all of a sudden Brown came out of nowhere, it seemed, and won 3 or 4 in a row. I don't remember the exact number. Is there anything in your book that we didn't know about how close it was, and just how close do you think it was down to the wire?
Oh, well, I do write about his stumbles at the end, the interview with Playboy and Lust in My Heart, and the comment he made in Philadelphia about ethnic neighborhoods and their viability, which also got him into a lot of trouble with liberals in the African American community. And yes, there was in the primaries, Jerry Brown at the end, won Maryland at the last minute, sort of very late in the campaign season. And interestingly enough, this weekend down in Plains, I learned that Nancy Pelosi had been hired by Jerry Brown to be his point person, campaign manager in that Maryland primary. And because of her ties to Baltimore, her father, had been mayor of Baltimore years earlier. And she did such a good job that Jerry Brown then, having won that primary, Jerry Brown then subsequently convinced Nancy Pelosi to run for Congress herself in California. And so this is the beginning of Pelosi's career. But I have to confess that my book covers, Carter's whole life, his childhood and all the way through, and the campaign, but it is heavily focused on the White House years.
Thank you. We have a bunch more questions. So Kai, if you could be as succinct as possible. Next, we have Barbara Couple.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. I wanted to ask you about his relationship with the Sandinistas and Somoza, and whether it was Brzezinski's guidance that he was following there, because he is a very moral person and he backed the wrong guy. And he even, after Somoza fled and it was getting close to the end of the war, the U.S. still wouldn't recognize the Sandinistas unless they kept the Guardia. And the Sandinistas said, we're not doing that. That's who we're fighting. So who was it who prolonged that until they finally won? And was it Carter or Brzezinski? It doesn't sound like something Carter would have done.
Yes, it was Brzezinski. That's the short answer.
All right.
And Carter didn't, know the ins and outs of the internal politics of Nicaragua, but he was skeptical of Somoza and was, in fact, his whole Latin American policy was aimed at trying to encourage the dictatorships down there to give way to democratic rule. And in the end, he was actually pretty successful in that. But you're right. He with Brzezinski's encouragement, he tried to lay down conditions in Nicaragua, and again, events on the ground, like events on the ground in Iran, just took over.
Thank you. We'll have Michael Goodman and then Malcolm Byrne. Michael Goodman, brief question, please. We're running out of time.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to ask if you could comment quickly on the snafu that developed when Carter wanted to appoint Ted Sorensen as CIA director, and also a quick comment on, I think the rumor was that Carter established a very bad personal relationship with the West German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt. So thanks. Thanks for taking the questions.
Thank you.
Yes, actually, most people probably have forgotten that Carter's first pick as CIA director was Ted Sorensen, the former Jack Kennedy speechwriter. And Sorensen was actually reluctant to take this position, but it was offered. He had supported Carter during the campaign. And then it very quickly got into trouble with the confirmation hearings. And it emerged that Sorensen had been a CEO, a conscientious objector during World War II. This is actually quite well known. It wasn't a secret. But Carter's people hadn't really focused on this part of his resume. So that was that information came out again, was retreaded, but the actual, ironically enough, the actual thing that killed Sorensen's nomination came from Joe Biden, a young freshman senator from Delaware who held a press conference and ironically announced that his staff had found a affidavit, a letter that Sorensen had signed on behalf of one Dan Ellsberg, who during the Ellsberg 1971 trial for releasing the Pentagon Papers, in which Sorensen was trying to support Ellsberg with the argument that, foreign policy officials during the 60s and regularly took home classified papers to their home. It wasn't unusual. Hey, he was quite right. Averell Harriman did this all the time, for instance. So Sorensen was trying to help Ellsberg, and Biden held a press conference saying, this is outrageous. Maybe Ted Sorensen should be tried for taking home classified materials himself. And this sort of was the last straw, and Carter very reluctantly agreed that Sorensen had to withdraw his nomination. And in retrospect, he thought this was a mistake. It sent a message to the press and to his political opponents that he could be swayed, that he wasn't up for a hard-fought political battle. But that's what happened. And I'm not going to go into Helmut Schmidt because we're out of time.
Yes, let me ask Malcolm Byrne. I think that'll be our last question. Malcolm?
Okay, thank you, Christian. Tom Schwartz asked my Iran question, Kai, but I want to pick another raw moment for Jimmy Carter in foreign policy, which was his reaction to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with John Martin's colleague, Frank Reynolds at ABC, when he said that moment changed his views about Soviet behavior more drastically than all of the previous 2.5 years. What did that episode tell you about Carter?
Well, I think it, again, is a reflection of Brzezinski. By the time the invasion took place, Carter was feeling very worn down by Brzezinski, who had, was nagging him all the time about the Soviet Union. And here, they had good intelligence that the Soviets were about to do this. They actually had good intelligence, too, that the internal debate inside the Politburo reflected what was fierce, and that there were some members of the Politburo who understood that this could be a tar baby and that it was a mistake. Brzezinski nevertheless made the argument that this proved that the Soviets were an aggressive opponent intent on expanding their empire. And Carter, went along with this argument. He was personally shocked by the blatant nature of the Soviet intervention, which people have to remember, ironically, was an intervention to depose a hardline Communist Party faction and to put in power a more moderate version of the Communist Party. So, it's Afghanistan. And the actual, sadly, the result of this change in policy was that Carter began to give in more and more to Brzezinski. And Cy Vance could see that he was losing influence and losing the argument. And this became the source of his decision a few months later to resign the secretary position. And again, I think Carter was ill-served by Brzezinski's advice, and that he overreacted to the Soviet invasion, and that it was, sort of as we look upon it today, it sort of was a last gasp of the Cold War conflict and the Soviet hardliners, and not, as Brzezinski was arguing, evidence of a newly aggressive Soviet empire.
Thank you. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Meg, for this conversation. I apologize to all of those whose questions we couldn't get to, and there were many. We could have clearly gone on for quite some time, but we have to bring this to a close, and Eric will do that with some concluding remarks. Eric.
Right. Well, my thanks as well to Kai, Meg, and of course, Christian. We hope to see you all next week on Monday, July 19th at 4 p.m. when we return to discuss Wendy Goldman and Donald Pulitzer new book, Fortress Dark and Stern, The Soviet Home Front During World War II. Till then, good night and take care.